hinges on the reality that Jesus was raised to life. He was raised from the dead. And we think about that first morning, the woman who arrived there, and they find the stone rolled away, and they go in and see that the body's not there. And it's interesting, their first response is they're puzzled, they're perplexed. How could this be? Even though Jesus had told them many times, like on the third day I'll be raised to life. Yet they're puzzled, they don't know what's happened. And so they go back out of the tomb, and this angel appears to them and says to them, says the word remember. It says, come on, remember. And in the Greek means to actively remember, to keep before you. Remember what he told you. Remember the promise. On the third day, he'd be raised to life. And after the angel said that, they remembered. And in that moment of remembering, hope is ignited in them, and they run to the disciples. They run to the disciples to tell them about this promise. Remember what Jesus said, after 3 days, he'd be raised to life. And as they're running, this is what it says in Matthew 28, verse 9. Matthew 28, verse 9. It says, and as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, rejoice. Wouldn't that be, you're running, there you are, you're running to tell the disciples, that Jesus is alive, and then you run smack bang into the man himself, Boom. There he is. And the first word, this is what I want us to think about this morning, the first word that came out of the risen Lord's mouth, the very first thing he said is rejoice. Rejoice. It's the same Greek word that Paul uses in Philippians where he says to the church, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. In other words, be filled with joy. And so the hope that's been ignited all of a sudden, there's this, I think their response is they fall down and they worship the risen Jesus in that moment. But he says rejoice, be full of joy. The first word Jesus spoke to his followers, the first thing he said to his disciples, to his believers, was to rejoice. I think there's something in that for you and I today. If the risen Jesus was to walk into the room, I think he'd want to say the same thing. He'd want to say to you and I as his followers, come on, rejoice, be filled with joy. There's something to celebrate here. I'm alive. He'd say, disciples, be filled with joy, rejoice. Rejoice. I think Jesus would want us to be a people who are filled with joy. And if there's something that I believe we need more of in the church, it's joy. Something we need more of in the church, it's joy. If there's something as you and I, as we live our lives, as we go about our week, something that would distinguish us or set us apart from other people around us, is that we would carry joy. The joy that we follow a risen Lord. People would notice that. It's worth being joyful about. So I think it's significant that Jesus would say to his followers, rejoice. This is worth celebrating. Joy is a fruit of the Spirit. It's evidence of his presence. You can't have too much joy. You can't, there is no limit to the amount of joy that we can experience in our life. God is not concerned about his people becoming too joyful. Did you know that? He's not sitting in heaven thinking, well, man, I've just got to, Joel's just, he's just bursting too much. I've got to pull back some of that joy. No, he's not concerned. In fact, I think he's more concerned about the lack of joy in his people. And I just think, why I'm sharing this morning, because I believe we're coming into a season where we need more joy, that God would want to release an outpouring of joy by his Spirit upon us. And there's this conviction, this pursuit, this deep desire within me to see an increase in the level of joy among God's people. The first thing Jesus would say to his followers would be rejoice. He'd say rejoice. So I'm going to look at a verse. This is an interesting verse for me in the life of Jesus, which, every time I read it, it kind of grabs me, and I try and imagine this moment in the life of Jesus? Do you do that sometimes as you're reading the scriptures? You sort of read about it and you try and imagine what's going on in that moment. And when you sort of unpack the Greek and look into it a bit more, it paints a picture of what is happening in these moments. And this is a moment of joy in the life of Jesus. He's just spent some time with 70 disciples. They were sent out. Jesus gave them authority. They went out proclaiming the message of the kingdom, and they were seeing sick people being healed and restored, and those who were oppressed by the powers of darkness were being set free. And so you can imagine the disciples returned. There was a sense of wanting to share all this with Jesus, and so they sit down together and they share with Jesus all that's been happening. And then after they've had this time with Jesus, it says in Luke 10:21, it says, "At that time, Jesus, full of joy through the Holy Spirit, said, 'I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth.'" The Amplified says, "In that very hour he was overjoyed and rejoiced greatly in the Holy Spirit." So here is Jesus. He is full of joy by the Holy Spirit. And it's that word joy in the Greek that kind of helps us imagine or visualize what's happening there. Because it means that he became so glad that he jumped in celebration. The literal translation is very much leaping, very much leaping. So this is, like I've grown up with a perception of Jesus, like we've had pictures on the wall and often there's paintings of him with a little lamb and things like that. But Jesus was an emotional guy. He had emotions. In fact, every one of us in this room, we are emotional creatures. God has created you with emotions. You have emotions. You can't go to the doctor and have them removed. They're a part of who you are. Your emotions are intended to be there. God has created us that way. And Jesus, he was emotional. Think about it. When he was in the temple, what did he do? He got a little angry, didn't he? He got a little worked up, and he went in there and he started turning over the tables of the money changers. And as he's turning them over in his anger, he's saying, God's house is a house of prayer. Over goes another table. It says, "You've made it a den of thieves." Over goes another table. In the moment, he's emotional. And then if you imagine this moment, here he is with the disciples, and in this moment, it's like Jesus is so full of joy that he's jumping, he's leaping, he's celebrating. I don't know, maybe that doesn't fit with your perception of what Jesus was, but I get a little encouraged that Jesus got so excited that he began to leap. Celebration, right there before the other disciples. Agalio, so glad one jumps in celebration. Look at it again. He was so full of joy through the Holy Spirit that he is jumping and leaping, and then he begins to praise the Father. What's the point? The point is this. There is a joy that can only be found in the Holy Spirit. There is a joy that can only be found in the Holy Spirit. It's different to anything that the world can offer us. We can do different things. We can have things that we experience that bring gladness and joy. But this is different. This is only found in the Holy Spirit. The joy that Jesus experienced is so powerful, so intense and deep that he is leaping and jumping in celebration. It is only found in the Holy Spirit. Now, I want to make this clear. This is not about all of us, all of a sudden, we're going to start leaping and jumping. No, that's not the point. This is about experiencing the Holy Spirit in such a way that a joy comes. We experience a joy that all of a sudden, your feet might just start moving a little bit, And then, that joy, it increases, and all of a sudden your hands start going as well. And all of a sudden, you can't help yourself because the joy of the Holy Spirit is so deep, it's so real, it's so powerful that it begins to overflow and affect every part of who we are. But the joy of the Holy Spirit is what is happening here for Jesus in this moment. And he begins to leap, he begins to jump around in that moment. If we want more joy, the Holy Spirit is the key. Holy Spirit is the presence of God on the earth. When we think about the Trinity, I love the verse that we learnt this morning. It paints a clear picture. When we think about the Trinity is that our God is three, yet He is one. He is Father, He is the Son, He is the Holy Spirit. At the same time, He is one. But if we need to, this is the foundational understanding of the Trinity right now. We need to know that God the Father is on His throne in glory. God the Son, we heard it read to us, the memory verse, we quoted it. He is now where? At the right hand of the Father. He ascended to that place. The Holy Spirit is the presence of God on the earth. The Holy Spirit is the presence of God on the earth. And it's the Spirit of God, the presence of the Holy Spirit, is the one that brings joy. There is this inseparable link between joy and the presence of the Holy Spirit. The psalmist, he puts it this way. He says in Psalm 16:11, "In your presence is fullness of joy." In your presence is fullness of joy. Now, he could have said any number of things there. He could have said, in your presence is fullness of love, fullness of mercy, fullness of peace. But he said, in your presence is fullness of joy. This is the key. This is the point. The presence of God, joy is the non-negotiable evidence of the presence of God. Joy is the non-negotiable evidence of the presence of God. It's not up for debate. It's there in black and white. It's crystal clear. In your presence is fullness of joy. I want us to, when we think about, just park that for a moment, that the Holy Spirit, the presence of the Holy Spirit is the key to joy. And, we are created, we are designed for His presence. If we go back to the creation story, Genesis, what's interesting to me is that, we know for a fact that every time God spoke, things happen. You read the creation story, it's a series of God speaking, and then creation happens. God speaks, things happen. But here's the thing that is really interesting. You might find this interesting as well, is that when God created the animals, He spoke to the environment. So when He created the fish, He spoke to the sea. He spoke to the environment that He wanted the creatures to thrive in, to live in, to dwell in. When he created the land animals, He spoke to the land. So he spoke to the environment that was best suited for them. Now, if you take, and you understand this, when you take a fish out of that environment and put it on the land, it's not going to survive. It's going to struggle for a little while. And then, and the same with land animal. Take a land animal, put it in the ocean, not going to survive. He spoke to the environment that was best suited for them, and they would survive and they would thrive in. When He created humanity, He spoke to Himself. Now, if you realize that God talked to Himself, well, He did. It's in the creation story. He spoke to Himself, and He addressed Himself as we, or us, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So the environment that you and I are best suited for is within His presence. We are created for His presence. We will thrive in His presence. We will experience a greater level of joy in His presence. When we live with a level of disconnect from His presence, we suffer. We won't thrive. We'll live beneath what the very best that God has for us. We are designed, we are created for His presence. And in His presence is fullness of joy. Jesus, in the presence of the Holy Spirit, experienced great joy. The International Standard Version for that verse about Jesus we read earlier says, the Holy Spirit made Jesus extremely joyful. The Holy Spirit made Jesus extremely joyful. This is a quote there on the screen from an early day Salvation Army. Like I loved sitting and reading about the early day Salvation Army and when they gathered together. These services where there was just so much the work of God is happening, many people being saved, many people being transformed by the work of the Holy Spirit. And I read a lot about Commissioner Elijah Cadman, incredible moves of the Spirit when the people would gather together. And this is Bramwell Booth, and he was the second general, the son of William Booth, who was the first general. Him and his wife Catherine, they pioneered the Salvation Army. And this is what he writes. He says, men and women would suddenly fall flat upon the ground and remain in a swoon or a trance for many hours, rising at last so transformed by joy that they could do nothing but shout and sing in an ecstasy of bliss. And this was regular occurrence. The Spirit of God would move powerfully. People would be transformed by joy. Transformed. So full of joy that it begins to overflow from them. The Holy Spirit made Jesus extremely joyful. That word, agalio, getting so glad one jumps in celebration. One of the most joy-filled moments where the Holy Spirit is at work is in the work of salvation. When someone comes to faith, when they come to that moment of eyes being open, getting a revelation of who Jesus is and all that he's done, the Holy Spirit is at work in that moment, and people are often filled with joy. It's a work of the Spirit. Salvation. We don't come to faith in God. We don't come to that place of salvation without the Holy Spirit being involved. You take the Holy Spirit out of the picture, there is no salvation. The Holy Spirit is intimately and powerfully present in that moment when someone comes to faith. He's at work. And often you hear people sharing their story about the joy of that moment. The joy. And the passage we heard earlier read to us from Dan, this moment where the jailer, him and all his family, they come to faith in Jesus. 1 minute he's ready to fall on his sword, to throw it all away. The next moment after hearing about Jesus, like the Holy Spirit works in such a way that his eyes are open. He gets a revelation of who Jesus is and all that Jesus has done for him, that he steps into the kingdom. He's born again, we would say. New life, full of joy. And the Holy Spirit is present in that moment. Look at Acts chapter 16, verse 34. It says, he and everyone who lived with him were filled with joy. They had become believers in God. The Amplified Translation, that word joy there in that passage is the same word in the verse about Jesus, agalio. Same word, very much leaping. And so the Amplified Translation actually expands that. It says, he leaped much for joy with all his family. So they've come to this moment of salvation, of realizing who Jesus is, and the Holy Spirit is right there, and they're filled with joy. So him and the whole family start jumping together. I don't know what that. Have you done that as a family before? Maybe they linked arms and just started bouncing, celebration. But like a team who's just won a tournament or the final game, and they all jump together. Well, this family is all jumping for joy because of Jesus. Because of what he's done. They've found Jesus, and the Holy Spirit has been there working with them to open their eyes. I think, like David talks about, you restore unto me the joy of my salvation. Take not the Holy Spirit from me. The Holy Spirit and the joy of salvation are linked together. You cannot separate them. This joy in your presence is fullness of joy. It's not just for individuals. It's for families. Here was a family, a household who experienced this together. Joy found in the Holy Spirit is not just for individuals, it's for families, it's for households. Joy in the Holy Spirit is for marriages. It's for church community, for us to know, for us to experience. The first word that the risen Jesus would say to his followers, he would say to you and I, is rejoice. Be filled with joy. Be filled with joy. The thing about the Holy Spirit is there's this element of mystery. It's mystical. Now, John says it's like the wind. He blows around. And, I wish there's not some formula that I could give you this morning, like you say, man, I just could do with more joy in my life and my marriage and my family. Well, it's not, if you stand on one leg, put your hand on your head, then you'll have joy. No, there's no formula. It's mystical. There's an element of mystery. I wish I could say, come and grab a bookmark and you're going to walk away with more joy. There's one word that will position us to experience joy that is found in the Holy Spirit. It's hunger. It's hunger. The question is, do we want this? If so, where's my hunger level? So I'm asking you the question this morning, are you hungry for joy that can only be found in the Holy Spirit?